Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë, the role of the governess. It's stated in the introduction to this novel that Agnes Grey may be defined in part as a social cause novel. And the main reason for this is that during the 1840s, the plight of governesses started to become highlighted by people in public life. People started to become aware of the fact that governesses were heavily exploited and maltreated within the families that they worked. Often they had to work for extremely long hours and they were paid very poorly. The conditions in which they lived were often psychologically very difficult, could be extremely lonely. They were not properly part of the family. On the other hand, they were also not properly part of the servant group within the household. Most governesses would probably have chosen not to socialise with servants, even if they had been categorised with them. There was always a difficulty in overcoming the ambiguity of being employed but living with one's employers. Because of the extremely strong sense of social class at the period, a governess coming from a family with an educated background necessarily would feel herself to be the social equal, or to have a parity of social status with her employers, but because of her financial circumstances and because of being employed by them, she took on an anomalous role where she was in some ways acknowledged socially and in other ways excluded, in some ways employed and in other ways simply taken for granted as part of the amenities, the furniture, the fabric of the household, whereas of course obviously the governess was a person. There were many difficulties for governesses in that they had no security of employment. They lived with their employers and often their financial circumstances were very needy. It could be, what likely was the case, that if a governess suddenly lost her employment, she would have nowhere to live. She would have absolutely as well no means of supporting herself. Governesses who lost their position perhaps due to a fall or a change in circumstances of their employers, perhaps their employers suddenly suffered financial losses, or perhaps they moved to a different part of the country or moved to a different part of the empire. A governess might suddenly find herself without employment. There was no social security at the time, and employers were not obliged to give any level of notice. Such a sudden loss of income, such a sudden loss of residence could be devastating to a life. There were instances of governesses who were between engagements or who had no prospect of work, actually being in a state of starvation. A typical technique to try and stave off extreme hunger was to tie a cloth around the waist really, really tightly to try and, I suppose, assuage the sensations of extreme hunger in the stomach. Quite a number of governesses who were suddenly let go from their employment sadly found themselves with no other option apart from becoming prostitutes. And this was, really, I should imagine, an unbearable experience, especially because many governesses actually came from families where the father was a clergyman. Young women who had grown up in a clergyman's family were in high demand as governesses because they had often been well tutored by their fathers. Agnes, for example, in this novel has learnt Latin with her father. That was relatively unusual for girls at the period to have such an academic aspect to their education. Many people going out to work as governesses had the more accomplishment-based education, so that type of education where girls learned superficial skills that were attractive in company, or that would suggest that they would make good companions to their husbands as wives. So the ability to play music, the ability to paint or to draw, the ability to sing, the ability to do needlework, which would be useful, and embroidery, which would be decorative. A lot of girls' education was dancing as well, was another important accomplishment. Arithmetic, grammar, English grammar, languages were of course also learnt. That was prized, but often not with a great deal of grammar, not with a great deal of true competency. So as well, one of the reasons that governesses were mistreated and also were not, just generally not regarded with very much respect, was the fact that also many governesses had very little education themselves. They were struggling to try and school their pupils because they themselves hadn't been taught very much. The number of governesses in the country was quite high. In 1851 there were 24,770 governesses. So it's quite a lot of women looking for employment in this way. Competition for positions was quite high. It was so high, in fact, that in 1862 there were 810 applications for a position paying just £15 per annum. Of course, bed and board and food, meals would have been included in that as a package. That would have been additional to the £15 per annum. The average salary of the period was, for being a governess, was £25 per annum. So it can be seen how employers could mistreat governesses and get away with it, because there were so many women competing for these few positions that were available. One of the reasons for this was that at the period, if a middle-class woman found herself in reduced circumstances, there were really only 3 careers that were regarded as socially acceptable. One was to be a writer, for which obviously opportunities were relatively scant. The other was to be an artist, for which one needed really to be successful, proper professional training, but this didn't become available widely to women until much later in the century. It started to become available in the 1850s, but it took time to actually expand as an education open to women. Without professional training, a woman was always at a disadvantage, and a lot of women artists, as a result, stuck to quite domestic themes: flowers, fruit, some domestic interior scenes. So, in many respects, being a governess was the only avenue open to a lot of women, unless they took the difficult step of lowering their social position by engaging in a different form of employment. Because, as I was mentioning, there were so many hardships suffered by governesses. In 1841, through public activation, the Governess's Benevolent Society was founded, and this had a fund to assist governesses who were in severe financial distress. In 1847, Charles Kingsley of King's College London, he was a lecturer there, began a series of lectures for women aimed specifically at granting a certificate of proficiency to governesses to help improve their standing, to improve their status. The curriculum of the lectures was really quite rudimentary: grammar, arithmetic, some lectures in English literature, sociology, philosophy and science. It wasn't really expected that the women attending these lectures would rise to great academic heights, but it was hoped that what they learnt, they would learn thoroughly, and as a result this would equip them far better for the work that they needed to undertake as governesses. Given that we're reading a novel about a governess written by Anne Brontë, it may be interesting to consider comments that Charlotte Bronte made about the role of governess. In 1854, Charlotte Bronte wrote, "Already governesses are not half nor a quarter paid for what they teach, nor in most instances is half or a quarter of their attainments required by their pupils." Despite the drawbacks of working as a governess, though, Charlotte Bronte considered the girl who stays at home doing nothing is worse off than the hardest wrought and worst paid drudge of a school teacher. That was in 1859 that she said that. Interestingly, thinking about the character of Agnes Grey and how she needs to gird herself psychologically to survive the experience of being a governess, Charlotte Bronte also seemed to think that a governess needed a long-suffering, self-denying, reflective and intelligent character. Probably we see all of these qualities in Agnes Grey, and there's no doubt about it that Anne Brontë, in writing this novel, brings a very honest account to the role of governess. Had the book been more widely read, I think it could have actually been very helpful to the position, to the situation of governesses. It's really quite illuminating still today. So in writing this novel, Anne Brontë really lends her voice to the social cause of the governess that was receiving attention at this period. It's quite a topical novel. Despite what today we might think of as quite staid, quite slow pace of the storytelling, it was really quite topical for the period. Some of the difficult aspects of being a governess are brought out in the novel really quite graphically, quite vividly. Isolation is Agnes's isolation is very clearly delineated. Page 155. In returning to the lodge, I felt happy and thanked God that I had now something to think about, something to dwell on as a relief from the weary monotony, the lonely drudgery of my present life. For I was lonely. Never from month to month, from year to year, except during my brief intervals of rest at home, did I see one creature to whom I could open my heart or freely speak my thoughts with any hope of sympathy, or even comprehension. Never one unless it were poor Nancy Brown, with whom I could enjoy a single moment of real social intercourse, or whose conversation was calculated to render me better. My only companions had been unamiable children and ignorant, wrong-headed girls, from whose fatiguing folly unbroken solitude was often a relief, most earnestly desired and dearly prized. But to be restricted to such associates was a serious evil, both in its immediate effects and the consequences that were likely to ensue. Part of the problem here was the ambivalent attitude of employers towards governesses. On the one hand, they wanted governesses to bring their children up effectively, to educate them both in terms of their manners, their social etiquette, their understanding of right and wrong as well. But they wanted the governess also to undertake teaching, so teaching English, teaching mathematics, languages. And then they also wanted the governess to teach these accomplishments that I discussed earlier. Really, the role is way too wide, the role is way too broad. Teaching children right and wrong, teaching children about good conduct and good behaviour and consideration for others is really the role of a mother in large part, and teachers and governesses back that up. They add to that. It's not their sole role. But this is definitely, in Agnes's experience, not the case. Both of the mothers whom she encounters, Mrs. Bloomfield and Mrs. Murray, think that it is Agnes's job to teach their children basic basic tenets of being a civilised human being. For example, Mrs. Broome, when she first meets Agnes, she has quite a large number of children. Some have moved out of the nursery. Others are still being taken care of by a nursery maid. The mother says, "You will find them," that's to say the children, "not very far advanced in their attainments," she said, "for I have had so little time to attend to their education myself, and we have thought of them too young for a governess till now. But I think they are clever children, and very apt to learn, especially the little boy. He is, I think, the flower of the flock, a generous, noble-spirited boy, one to be led but not driven." The mother then says, "His sister Marianne will require watching, but she is a very good girl on the whole, though I wish her to be kept out of the nursery as much as possible, as she is now almost 6 years old and might acquire bad habits from the nurses." In fact, the mother's view of her children, that her son is generous and noble-spirited, is, as is illustrated later in the novel, totally inaccurate. That Marianne is a very good girl is, again, totally inaccurate. She's not at all. She's got absolutely no idea of how to behave. She's really a spoiled brat, as is the son, because the mother has given them no guidance at all. She's been present in the house, but she's been at another level an absentee mother. So despite wanting the children to be completely moulded by the experience of living and working with a governess, because, as in the case of Agnes Grey, for example, she's expected to have the young daughter Marianne sleeping in the same room as her in order to keep an eye on her 24 hours a day. Despite expecting a governess to entirely mould their children, these families didn't spend a great deal of time in seeking out someone who was capable of fulfilling such a role. They would have had to pay a lot of money for someone who really could have fulfilled such a role, because they would have needed and required an extensive education to be capable of it. In chapter 4, Mrs. Brimfield's mother-in-law indicates to Agnes that she is given insufficient support for taking care of the children by half sentences interspersed with nods and knowing winks. Her sense of the injudicious conduct of their mamma in so restricting my power and neglecting to support me with her authority. And there are many examples in this novel of how the authority of Agnes as governess is completely undermined. There's one occasion where the little boy has made a lot of mess and Agnes is insisting that he should clean it up before he's given his supper. He screams and wails and shouts until his mother finally comes into the room, at which point he's given his supper, the mess is cleared up by the maids, and Agnes is totally undermined. Another way in which Agnes's authority is undermined is by the very uncivil treatment that she receives, especially from Mr. Bloomfield, and this again entirely undermines her authority. Mr. Bloomfield has not as yet been introduced to Agnes, and in seeing her outside with the children and not having been pleased by the fact that he's seen them splashing in some water, he says, "Miss Grey, I suppose it is Miss Grey. I am surprised you should allow them to dirty their clothes in that manner. Don't you see how Miss Bloomfield has soiled her frock, and that Master Bloomfield's socks are quite wet, and both of them without gloves? Dear, dear, let me request that in future you will keep them decent, at least." So saying, he turned away and continued his ride up to the house. This was Mr. Bloomfield. I was surprised that he should nominate his children Master and Miss Bloomfield, and still more so that he should speak so uncivilly to me, their governess, and a perfect stranger to himself. So there are a number of instances there that although Agnes is living closely with the children, she even has one of them sleeping in the same room as her, she's not to call them by their Christian names, but to address them as Miss and Master Bloomfield, and to refer to them as such to their parents. Agnes doesn't do this, despite this indication, this early indication in the employment that perhaps it's expected. She amends this at the next household where she goes to work, because she feels it was one of the reasons why things did not go so well with the Brimfields. However, there's another instance where Mr. Brimfield speaks very uncivilly to Agnes, and it's when the children have been grinding eggshells in their playroom and making a bit of a mess on the carpet. But such examples of addressing their teacher will only serve to make the children play up even more. So it's counterproductive, but obviously very frustrating to the governess, and leading to a sense of powerlessness. And, you know, Agnes was restricted from punishing the children by the Bloomfield parents directly herself. And then when her authority is undermined by the parents, and then she can't keep control of the children, you can see how many governesses might have started to feel desperate. In Agnes's case, she knows that she can return to her family, but many other governesses would not necessarily have been in that situation. Yes. At the Murray household, there's quite a strong expectation that Agnes will teach the young girls accomplishments. Rosalie is amenable to this, more so than her sister Georgiana. But again, at the Murray family, the children have not been taught basic precepts of good behaviour. They haven't been taught basic principles of consideration towards others and kindness, humanity. They haven't been taught at all, actually. Rosalie Murray had never been perfectly taught the distinction between right and wrong. She had, like her brothers and sisters, been suffered from infancy to tyrannize over nurses, governesses and servants. She had not been taught to moderate her desires, to control her temper or bridle her will, or to sacrifice her own pleasure for the good of others. Her temper being naturally good, she was never violent or morose, but from constant indulgence and habitual scorn of reason, she was often testy and capricious. Her mind had never been cultivated. Her intellect at best was somewhat shallow. She possessed considerable vivacity, some quickness of perception, and some talent for music and the acquisition of languages. But till 15 she had troubled herself to acquire nothing. Then the love of display had roused her faculties and induced her to apply herself, but only to the more showy accomplishments. And when I came, it was the same. Everything was neglected but French, German, music, singing, dancing, fancy work, and a little drawing. Such drawing as might produce the greatest show with the smallest labour, and the principal parts of which were generally done by me. To music, indeed, she devoted too much of her time. As governess though I was, I frequently told her. But her mother thought that if she liked it, she could not give too much time to the acquisition of so attractive an accomplishment. And at the Murray family, the main emphasis is on the acquirement of accomplishments by the daughters. The second daughter, Mathilde, Agnes describes, Mathilde is quite a wild girl, and quoting, "As an animal, Mathilde was all right, full of life, vigour and activity. As an intelligent being, she was barbarously ignorant, indocile, careless and irrational, and consequently very distressing to one who had the task of cultivating her understanding, reforming her manners, and aiding her to acquire those ornamental attainments which, unlike her sister, she despised as much as the rest." So, normally speaking, this fundamental orientation of a person's character would be undertaken by parents. The parents, in particular Mrs. Murray, are not happy with the direction in which Mathilde is going. They're not happy with her interests, the overall demeanour that she displays, that she spends a lot of time riding, she spends a lot of time in the stable yard, she spends a lot of time discussing horses and dogs. I think this probably includes racing, betting, not to say perhaps breeding. Mathilde as well swears a great deal, which was really taboo for young ladies of the period. The text goes on to say, her mother was partly aware, only partly aware of her deficiencies, Mathilde's deficiencies, and gave me many a lecture as to how I should try to form her tastes and endeavour to rouse and cherish her dormant vanity. and by insinuating skillful flattery to win her attention to the desired objects, which I would not do, and how I should prepare and smooth the path of learning till she could glide along it without the least exertion to herself, which I could not, for nothing can be taught to any purpose without some little exertion on the part of the learner. So again, this idea that hard work, application, concentration, diligence are all necessary in order to be able to live a worthwhile and fulfilling life that contains achievement is something that the family has totally neglected to teach the children, and leave it to an employee to undertake, which is totally unrealistic. So for a governess like Agnes, who is not a trained teacher, hasn't gone through teacher training, hasn't been instructed in the psychology of infants or teenagers, hasn't been taught methods of teaching and learning, it's really an impossible situation. The parents are very keen that the children should be happy, despite all the rigours of training and upbringing that the governess is expected to impose upon them. But there's very little interest in the welfare of the governess. Agnes notes this in chapter 7, which I think is where the last set of quotes also emanates from. Mrs. Murray says to Agnes, "But at all events, Miss Grey," she said, "I hope you will keep your temper and be mild and patient throughout, especially with dear little Charles. He is so extremely nervous and susceptible, and so utterly unaccustomed to anything but the tenderest treatment. You will excuse my naming these things to you, for the fact is I have hitherto found all governesses, even the very best of them, faulty in this particular. They wanted that meek and quiet spirit which St. Matthew, or some of them, says is better than the putting on of apparel. You will know the passage to which I allude, for you are a clergyman's daughter. But I have no doubt you will give satisfaction in this respect as well as the rest. And remember, on all occasions when any of the young people do anything improper, if persuasion and gentle remonstrance will not do, let one of the others come and tell me, for I can speak to them more plainly than it would be proper for you to do. And make them as happy as you can, Miss Grey, and I dare say you will do very well." So again, here we see with the Murray family that whilst some support is being offered to Agnes in the discipline of the children, she actually has no authority with the children to exert her view of whether or not their behaviour is good, if it's acceptable or unacceptable. That all has to be given over to the parents, who have not actually undertaken that role up until now. So it's a very confused situation. The text goes on in this vein. "I observed that while Mrs. Murray was so extremely solicitous for the comfort and happiness of her children, and continually talking about it, she never once mentioned mine. Though they were at home surrounded by friends, and I an alien among strangers, and I did not yet know enough of the world not to be considerably surprised at this anomaly." Yes, and perhaps again in that last comment we hear the voice of Anne Bronte's own experience. As I was mentioning earlier, some of the aspects of the novel appear to be Anne Bronte in retrospect, with a more rationalised response to the things that actually occurred to her. Interestingly as well, there's a little comment in this novel which seems to take up the idea of governesses, the majority of governesses not being adequately equipped in order to deliver the teaching and education that they were expected to deliver. Yes. This is again in chapter 7. Master Murray was about 11 when I came, a fine, stout, healthy boy, frank and good-natured in the main, and might have been a decent lad had he been properly educated. But now he was as rough as a young bear, boisterous, unruly, unprincipled, untaught, unteachable, at least for a governess under his mother's eye. His masters at school might be able to manage him better, for to school he was sent, greatly to my relief, in the course of a year. In a state, it is true, of scandalous ignorance as to Latin, as well as the more useful, though more neglected things. And this doubtless would all be laid to the account of his education having been entrusted to an ignorant female teacher, who had presumed to take in hand what she was wholly incompetent to perform. So Agnes's point here is that she did have the education to be able to teach this boy a number of subjects, including Latin, but because of his early upbringing and the lack of care that has been taken in instructing him in sort of fundamental precepts of civilized life, he was impossible for her to instruct. Again, this anomalous position of being both a resident and almost part of the family, but at the same time an employee, occurs in chapter 13, called The Primroses, which is in some respects a particularly charming book, a charming chapter within the book. Agnes is describing the way in which the two girls, Rosalie and Mathilde, behaved to her on their walk coming home from church. And it is that they persistently ignore her. So typically on a Sunday, coming out of church, the following dilemma would arise. Whether I walked with the young ladies or rode with their parents depended entirely upon their own capricious will. If they chose to take me, I went. If for reasons best known to themselves they chose to go alone, I took my seat in the carriage. I liked walking better, but a sense of reluctance to obtrude my presence on anyone who did not desire it always kept me passive on these and similar occasions. I never inquired into the causes of their various whims. Indeed, this was the best policy, for to submit and oblige was the governess's part, to consult their own pleasure was that of the pupils. But when I did walk, the first half of the journey was generally a great nuisance to me, as none of the before-mentioned ladies and gentlemen ever noticed me. It was disagreeable to walk beside them, as if listening to what they said, or wishing to be thought one of them, while they talked over me or across. And if their eyes in speaking chanced to fall on me, it seemed as if they looked on vacancy, as if they either did not see me, or were very desirous to make it appear so. It was disagreeable, too, to walk behind, and thus appear to acknowledge my own inferiority, for, in truth, I considered myself pretty nearly as good as the best of them, and wished them to know that I did so, and not to imagine that I looked upon myself as a mere domestic, who knew her own place too well to walk beside such fine ladies and gentlemen as they were, though her young ladies might choose to have her with them, and even condescend to converse with her when no better company were at hand. And I think that this passage is very eloquent. It really speaks for itself in discussing the ill-defined social situation of the governess. Anne, or Agnes rather, is very aware of her own social credentials, her own social status, and perhaps this seems at odds with her evangelicalism and the sort of scrupulous observance of the venial sins that I was discussing earlier, because isn't this a manifestation of pride, a venial sin? And the answer to that is, at this period, not quite, because the level of society into which one was born at this period, people still considered to have been decreed by God. It was God who decided at the time of birth, as an act of fate, whether one belonged to a very high social level or a middling social level, or a low social level. And accepting God's will in this sphere was regarded as very important. This was a useful situation for people who were born into higher social levels, of course, because it helped to maintain others in positions and roles in life that were, serving of one's own situation. It's something that I think fortunately has died out across European society today, at least. But Agnes feels quite justified in having a strong sense of her own social identity as a gentlewoman, and of having quite a strong sense of her social superiority to many as a gentlewoman, without in any way contravening her religious faith as she would have perceived it. There is a lot in this novel whereby social level is discussed in terms of, on the one hand, being affluent, being wealthy, and on the other hand, as being something that is related to one's education and one's sense of what constitutes good conduct, one's ideas as well of social etiquette. It's possible to combine wealth with gentility, although the Murray family does fall short of this in many respects. Agnes's family has a great deal of gentility but very little affluence. The Broomfields do not have gentility. Their money is newly acquired, and their behaviour is quite crass, and frequently contravenes any sense of good breeding. They are quite clearly at times plainly rude by any standards.